continue for around 25 minutes and stop at 11:45. So that's why I will really keep things general. So in the first part of my lecture, I focused on, as you know, a general overview of how coupled evolution of life and geochemistry occurred on planet Earth. I hope I was able to give you an idea of major events from a biogeochemical point of view, of course. But I'm sure you will find this perspective very useful for your, especially for those of you working in evolutionary biology. So in the second part, try to emphasize some aspects of modern biogeochemistry with focusing on oxygen and nitrogen. But these are, we teach a whole class on this for a semester, so I don't expect you to digest all this material. But in the final part, it will be a connection of the first two parts, but we will a little bit dive into the world of deep sea ecosystems. I'll briefly discuss hydrothermal vents and also some gas and methane based ecosystems. But since you are also all about, you are familiar with the evolutionary concepts, a very close field of study to evolutionary biology is, I think, astrobiology and origin of life in our planet, but also search of life in other solar system bodies, even in exoplanets. Okay, and actually one of the prevailing ideas currently, really different fields are now reaching a consensus on this. Different fields, I mean, cell biology, biochemistry, oceanography, evolutionary biology, phylogeny. Now, the idea that the first common ancestor of all life forms originated in a hydrothermal vent setting, in a high temperature. It was probably hyperthermophile, living in a dark ocean doing chemosynthesis, probably around the deep sea hydrothermal vent. Here you see a summary of this idea. But why is this idea important? Because it's a major, this is how a hydrothermal vent looks like when you dive to it, by the way. I have talked about, I have shown you some deep sea profiles. The deep sea is cold when you think about it here. In this case, this is Pacific. This is a hydrothermal vent from Lao Basin in the Western Pacific, around Fiji, between Fiji and Tonga Islands, which I went 2 cruises in there in the past 10 years. So what you have there is deep waters are mostly cold, 2 to 3 degrees, near freezing. But the vents themselves, they're very hot, 300, 350 degrees, 400 degrees. You may be asking why they don't just evaporate at those pressures. Actually, water is still a fluid. Okay, so that's why it's possible that it can carry dissolved chemically rich substances. But what the discussion with oxygen and oceanography is very important, because what is important is that from a chemosynthesis point of view, you need a redox interface, redox gradient, and you need both ends of this gradient. What is this? So you need a really reducing and chemically rich end member, which is the vent fluid, but you also need this oxygenated, cold, deep sea water. And oxygen is critical because you also need, it's like a battery, you need the other terminal, okay? You need to send the electrons somewhere. So the fact that the oceans are ventilated through polar seas, through cold water formation in polar oceans, is directly linked to life around hydrothermal vents. So it's strange, but they're linked, they're related. So in a way, because it's a cliche to say that, oh, the hydrothermal vents, they are completely decoupled from surface. No, they are not. Actual things are very much connected. But of course, the vents we had back in the day around the origin of life, The ocean did not contain oxygen, but there it contained other things which still enabled actually this connection, this flow of electrons, which I cannot discuss in detail now. There is no time, but it's basically in those days different mechanisms existed to make this possible. All right, it's a photo of tube worm colonies. They host actually they are in endosymbiosis they have endosymbiotic sulfur bacteria inside them, which feeds on the hydrogen sulfide injected from hot vents. They actually pump through their plumes, red plumes, this hydrogen sulfide to those cells, which then do chemosynthesis. But those cells, as I said, they also need oxygen. So that's why these tube worms, they're located in the mixing zone of the hot temp fluid, high temperature fluid with the deep sea, cold seawater. So they are located in this gradient. So life is possible around gradients. So being completely anoxic doesn't help. Being completely oxic also doesn't help. You need to be located around those gradients. So think about the cable bacteria and how they adapted to a gradient in sediments. And this is in this case how the tube worms adapt to a similar redox gradient, but in this case in the bottom of the sea. In a way, it's similar. Since Efe asked about Mars, I was inspired to add these slides also just to make this remaining minutes more enjoyable rather than full of scientific details. Mars is in a way, okay, there are a lot of efforts put on Mars, searching for life. Of course, we are searching for past life, more or less, because water existed on Mars, probably large lakes, and we are interested in looking at the sedimentary rocks from those ages, which may contain biomarkers or traces of life, which is great, of course. But at the very moment, Mars is pretty much dead. It's in a sort of thermodynamic equilibrium. The red color comes from mostly iron, but iron's fully oxidized form. It's basically rust. Imagine rust. Its color. Mars is a rusty planet, actually rusty and dusty, dry place, and there is no active plate tectonics on Mars, unlike Earth. So the question, of course, of looking for past life is Mars is a great place for that. But if you are interested in looking for finding life right now, detecting life, Mars is possibly not the place, but we have now much better candidates. And as I said in the first course, there's a lot of water in the solar system, and this water is also can exist as ice. And we see a lot of icy moons now in the moons of Jupiter and Saturn. In this case, this is Saturnian moon Enceladus, and the mission, the Cassini mission to the Saturn system actually discovered this icy shell, which is you see here, and they have discovered also plumes of particles or water vapor injected. So it shows that there's a volcanism and there's a plume of water vapor injected through these cracks. Here you see different images stacked up. But more importantly, from analyzing these plumes, the preliminary analysis showed that there is a saltwater ocean in liquid form beneath this icy shell. There's a geologically active seafloor and possibly hydrothermal vents. So there are water-rock interactions. Another similar system is the Europa of Jupiter, the moon Europa of Jupiter. It also has an icy shell. The moons of Jupiter was discovered by Galileo in 1610, and actually Europa was one of the first things he saw with his telescope. So there will be new missions flying to those systems within this decade, to be honest, not next decade, within this decade. There will be missions flying to Europa to search for possible ejections, let's say, of the underlying salt water. So you may also ask, why is this saltwater fluid? Due to the impact, due to the high gravitation of pulling of Jupiter and Saturn. So there's a lot of tidal motions, tidal heating going on, which people think, which keeps the saltwater oceans as fluid. But more importantly, there are vents underneath. There are volcanoes underneath these oceans, which makes them a spectacular candidate for search for current life. Okay. So very likely that, well, it's likely, not very likely that some microbial life may be in these moons. Who knows? We will find out. I think next 10 years, you may hear things about this, next 10, 15 years. So that's why it's important, not only for understanding modern oceanographic cycles or modern ecology or chemosynthetic ecology. It's also, if you are interested in searching for life, we don't even know how similar systems function, to be honest, on our present Earth. We don't have enough cruises, enough funding, very expensive to do this. But we need to, since we are investing so much on search of life in space, it makes a lot of sense to invest a little bit more to oceanography and deep sea ecosystems to support those conclusions, because they will generate a lot of data which will need to be verified in similar analog systems on Earth. So just briefly, let me give you an overview of what sort of seafloor chemosynthetic ecosystems that may be also existing in these moons, icy moons. Seafloor is a huge place, of course. There are all kinds of ecosystems. Chemosynthesis is not the only thing. Here you see in deep blue, there are abyssal plains, okay, full of a lot of different bentos. But when you look at these mid-ocean ridges here in shallow, you see they are basically underwater mountains. These are where the plate tectonics create the formation of mid-ocean regions. These are places where two plates, they are moving apart from each other. They can also clash each other. Then in that case, you have a subduction zone, such as here in South America, or that's the Mariana Trench, etc. So in both cases, you may have seafloor volcanism and hydrothermal vents. A very sketch of that's continental shelf in deep water. You can have hydrothermal vents. What is important is the microbes that eat sulfur here. They're also relatives of other microbes who live in different sulfur-rich systems. So in that case, evolutionary, they are related. Possibly the shallower species maybe evolved much later. Maybe the high temperature versions, they evolved earlier. These questions are still open, but we know that especially the macrofauna, which hosts all these sulfur microbes, they are totally endemic to the hydrothermal vents. So a lot of different questions can be asked. What are different habitat types? Which form of life? Where's the energy coming from? Remember our little table: energy, electrons, carbon. Always ask these things. And we also find more and more that the deep sea is quite coupled to global, the rest of the Earth system. It's affected by humans, affected by warming, pollution, etc., etc. So it's not isolated extreme systems which have been there since the formation of Earth and nobody's touching. No, they are really, really impacted by our own activity. That's our little table. Going fast, but the organic production in hydrothermal vents as a result of chemosynthesis can be as high, this is speaking of the rate and the amount of carbon stocked per meter square. They are as high as a productive rainforest. So imagine, look, if you go back to this map again, in all these, shallow area, in light blue areas, we have in a way rainforests that we don't even see. Here it's easy to see them from a satellite, but we don't see the rainforests of the deep sea. We are just discovering them by spot research. Okay, so it's quite, as I said, extreme environment. These are the current situation of what has been explored, what is there, what we expect to find in next decades. As you can see, we are more discovering the Arctic, the ridges in the Arctic and around the Antarctic. Not surprisingly, more and more vents will be found there. So as you can see, especially East Pacific Rise is quite well studied, Northern Atlantic Ridge. Because these are accessible mainly to Western countries, which had the research vessels and the submersibles, which some of them you see here. I was also lucky to dive with Alvin and Nautil of the friends. Alvin is American. I was able to dive 5 times, 4 times with Alvin, 1 time with Nautil to the deep Pacific. But there also, you can also explore them remotely with deep diving, remotely operated vehicles called ROVs. So there are different ways of, essentially these machines, they are for what a scientific diver would do in a field work. These submarines are for that. Typically 3 people going to these submarines, and 2 scientists and 1 pilot typically, and then you direct the work over there. The pilot does the job for you, manipulating the arms of the submarine, and there's a basket. You can collect samples, fluid samples, and biological specimens, etc. So it's a lot of fun. And unfortunately, there's not much time to tell you different stories from these dives, but ecologically, imagine vents as very, very extreme environments, high pressure, high temperature, no light. The food is limited. I mean, the food that rains from above, that's quite limited. So you need to rely on the food that's produced there. It's very metal rich, so it can be very toxic to many environments. It's a very fluctuating environment as well. Or sometimes you have volcanic explosions which can wipe out the whole communities. Black smokers, yes, maybe this is showing you the general chemistry of the vents. It's important to differentiate. We have the spectacular high temperature black smokers, but they're also along the sides, through the cracks, there are warm, cooler, but still warm fluids. They emerge. This is actually where you find the endosymbiotic macrofauna. They are more delicate. They cannot live on top of a chimney. Okay? Maybe bacteria can, but they locate themselves because they need substrate, to stable substrate with a nice cool mixing zone. So they prefer to be located in those environments, especially tube worms. A very funny way of looking at the food web in these systems. It's relatively simple compared to a more developed terrestrial or surface marine ecosystem. What's essential is that the base of the food web is, again, primary production, but through chemosynthesis. And this chemosynthesis occurs in 2 ways: through the macrofauna, actually, which cultivates chemosynthetic microbes themselves, but they're also free-living bacteria and archaea as biofilms, maybe attached to rocks, or as just drifting, floating around. So they all produce chemosynthetically, they conduct chemosynthetic primary production, but they're also, then the rest of the food web can be their suspension feeders, carnivores, symbiotic feeders, etc. There are all kinds of feeders and heterotrophic organisms. It acts as a hotspot of life, which then attracts also other deep sea, more mobile megafauna as well. Fish or larger octopus. They also come there to scavenge for food or use those ecosystems maybe for nursery, I don't know, for different habitat purposes, but it becomes a food web ecosystem habitat on its own. So these deep sea vents, it supports a whole range of biodiversity then. Of course, there are a lot of questions about adaptation, different fauna. I'm going fast here, but tube worms. Yes, this is just the concept I'm frankly giving you. Actually, the concept that these special tube worms, Riftia pachyphtili in this case, they relocate themselves to this mixing zone. Their plume are really, they're also mobile, so they can sniff oxygen sulfide and they can do that. We have developed over the years chemical sensors actually which can measure oxygen and sulfide in situ. So we dive with those sensors in submarines, and we directly measure the chemistry around these Riftia tube worms. So we have learned a lot past decade about how these guys behave and why they do what they do. There are also very extreme organisms in these vents. The most famous one is the Pompeii worm. I think it's the highest, most thermally tolerant organism on the planet. It lives practically on top of the chimneys, very near very hot water fluxes. And then, as far as we know, it's not doing chemosynthesis, though. It's interesting. It's more like a kind of a feeder, the deposit feeder. It does, though. It has elaborate adaptations about cooling itself. It cools itself via pumping out of water. So very strange organism. Maybe my last minutes, I don't want to take Arzu Hoca's time, but you know, ecology is not only about evolution of life and always good stories. We need to see the other side of the coin, which is the extraction, the utilization of ecosystems by humans. And the seafloor is not also unfortunately far from that. For example, there's a threat of seafloor mining. All these hydrothermal chimneys that I showed you, they contain massive amounts of precious metals. There are also other types of resources in the seafloor, which like seamounts, polymetallic nodules. There's a prospect of extraction of all these resources by companies, which, as you can imagine, it will result in a lot of impact in terms of loss of habitats, noise in the water column, release of toxic waste, etc. So we are also thinking about these impacts. We should be thinking about these impacts. Another important ecosystem, which deep sea ecosystem, which let me just mention very briefly. Again, similar to vents, you can also have chemosynthetic organisms around gas seeps. So, for example, in places like Black Sea, Eastern Mediterranean, there are a lot of natural gas well beneath the seafloor, but through cracks or through different channels, this gas can seep to the seafloor, to the sediment surface. In that case, it's similar mentality with it sets up a redox gradient. You have reducing hydrogen, methane fluxing out. It meets with the oxygenated seawater. Then once this sort of interface is set up, then microbes, they colonize the area. In this case, these become methane eating or hydrogen eating microbes. But then different higher level organisms such as mussels or even some tube worms, they can again go do symbiosis with these microbes and develop an entire ecosystem around also gas seeps.
Hocam, it would be really nice if you could wrap it up.
Oh yeah, I'm already wrapping up, as I said. I'm trying to go fast, but yeah, just to know you, for you to know that these sort of hydrothermal vents or gas seeps. I'm trying to find a photo of a gas seep ecosystem, but I couldn't. They also, increase the biodiversity in deep sea through different pathways, and enables basically chemosynthetic life in these ecosystems. But long story short, to search for life in alien worlds, you need to be searching for these sort of more primitive, possibly primitive and redox-dependent metabolic processes. You will not find very advanced life over there, but probably you need to be searching for signs of these sort of processes. So that's my final take-home message. It was a lot to digest, but I hope I was able to give you a few thinking points for you to take back. And when you listen to the rest of the courses, try to link. Also, if you find interesting links to what I have shown you, let me know also.